we won't even be a AAA. This is absolutely shocking to me, and it has tremendously dire consequences. I will close by just saying we cannot kick this can down the road anymore. We need to do something now. I've got a budget that balances within 10 years, and I would urge my colleagues to support it. Thank you.
Senator from Alabama.
I see my colleague, Senator Hatch, and will yield to him for 10 minutes, and will just thank my colleague, Senator Toomey, a member of the Budget Committee. He served on the House Budget Committee. He has worked hard, or is harder than maybe anybody on the committee, proposed a plan that will actually balance our budget within 10 years. It's the kind of thing we should be debating in the committee. Unfortunately, I know the senator's got to be deeply disappointed. We're not having a markup in committee. He's not even having a chance to bring forth his budget and defend it and point out why he believes it'll make America a better place. So thank you, Senator Toomey, for your contributions to debate and to the committee. Senator Hatch.
I want to thank
Senator Hatch is the ranking member of the Finance Committee, very, very significant and important committee that deals with the financial challenges our nation faces every day. Thank you, Senator Hatch.
Well, I thank
the senator from Utah.
Madam President, I thank my colleague and I thank Senator Toomey for his work. Early this year, along with every one of my Republican colleagues, I introduced a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. The people of Utah want this amendment, and polls show that if Congress were to pass it and send it to the states for ratification, it would have significant support across the country. From my perspective, the debate that we've been having over fiscal year 2012 budget this week, if you can even call it a debate, exemplifies yet again the need for a BBA. It seems like a simple thing, but the balanced budget amendment would require the President to submit and Congress to pass a balanced budget. Given the budget process over the last few years, this simple requirement takes on added significance. The fact is that it has been 756 days since Democrats passed any budget, the most basic of Congress's constitutional responsibilities. And the fact is that absent a balanced budget amendment, Congress will never adopt spending restraint necessary to restore constitutional limits on the federal government and the nation's fiscal integrity. The consequences of this ineptitude reached a new low on its Senate floor yesterday. The recap for those who missed it: Democrats took to the Senate floor and accused Republicans who are attempting to right our fiscal ship by reforming programs for the poor and elderly of seeking to harm women, children, and other vulnerable members of our society. This verbal assault was deliberate. It was premeditated. I actually thank my colleagues on the other side who declined to participate in those attacks. Those attacks might make for good politics, but they are terrible for this country. People here might like to deny it, but the fiscal crisis we face is real. They might like to say that Social Security's finances are just dandy, but the fact is that the Disability Trust Fund will be exhausted by 2018, and the overall trust fund will be exhausted in 2036, a year earlier than we previously thought. As bad as Social Security is, the situation with Medicare is even worse. According to the Congressional Budget Office, Medicare will be insolvent in 2020. According to the Medicare trustees, Medicare's unfunded liability is $38.4 trillion. And what is the Democrats' response to this? All is well. Nothing to see here. Please move along. This is what the Democratic candidate in New York's special election had to say about her opponent's claim that reforms to Medicare were necessary to restore the solvency of this program. Quote, "That's simply a scare tactic to tell our seniors that there will be nothing for them. That's not the truth," unquote. Republicans are trying to scare seniors? That's rich. A liberal surrogate for the Democrats is currently running an advertisement that shows House Budget Committee Chairman Paul Ryan pushing an old woman in a wheelchair off a cliff. Talk about a new low. The head of the Democratic National Committee, fresh from lecturing conservatives about civility in politics, described the House budget as a tornado through nursing homes. Yesterday, we retreated to claims on the Senate floor that stopped short of these attacks, but not that far short. Yet it is Republicans that are trying to scare seniors? Give me a break. Still, as bad as yesterday's display was, I ended my day positive about the future. Last night, I attended a dinner celebrating the centennial of President Ronald Reagan's birth. And at that dinner, I had the honor of introducing Lech Walesa, the former president of Poland, who who helped to roll back the Iron Curtain and liberate a continent. When Ronald Reagan became president, the Soviets were on the march. It was not a foregone conclusion that communism would wind up in the ash heap of history. And when Lech Walesa mounted the fence at the Gdansk shipyards, the only thing that he could be certain of was prosecution by communist authorities. But Reagan and Walesa understood something. They understood that communism was a lie played out on the world historical stage. And to borrow from Shakespeare, Reagan and Walesa understood that the truth will out. The fundamental truth that we face today, one that cannot be denied, is that our nation faces a spending crisis that no amount of additional taxes can fix. So let's talk about this budget process in a serious way. Unfortunately, doing so will not reflect well on this chamber. Borrowing from another one of Shakespeare's plays, in Hamlet, the character Marcellus observed that something is rotten in the state of Denmark. One might say the same about the Senate's action on the budget resolution. A budget is not law, but it is an important document that installs the guardrails for the operation of fiscal policy. Under the Congressional Budget Act, each body is to report a resolution by April 15th of each year. President Obama submitted his budget, and the House met the April 15th deadline. But Senate Democrats have no budget of their own. Here's the Senate budget resolution, just one big laid goose egg. So here we are today talking about the House-passed budget. The simple truth is that my colleagues on the other side don't want to vote on the Senate Democratic budget. Instead, they are determined to vote on a budget that everyone knows will not pass this body. Why is this? With all of their hard-edged partisan fury and not even a thin reed of fiscal governance, like Marcellus, it is reasonable to conclude that something is rotten in the U.S. Senate. And if we follow the scent with our noses, we'll find it comes down to numbers. The magic number is 50. There are 100 members of this body. 53 of those members caucus with the Democrats. So why aren't there 50 votes for a single Democratic budget? We have heard that Senate Democrats won't support the president's budget. The stated reason is that the president's do-over budget was nothing more than a speech that was so vague that our friends on the other side refused to treat it as a budget. I believe that there is a bigger problem holding up the Democratic caucus. You see, the heart and soul of the Democratic caucus is liberal. I respect that, but a healthy number of my friends on the other side are not entirely in that camp. And many more realize a pure liberal fiscal position might not be politically palatable. After all, the voters sent us a message last fall to get spending under control and not to hike taxes. So because Senate Democrats are jammed up and unable to get their act together, their leadership proposes no budget of their own. We are engaged in a Senate budget debate, but there is no substantive Senate Democratic budget before us. And we don't have one because at least 50 members of this body do not agree on one, even though they have 53 on their side. So how then do we define the majority's fiscal position? What budget would the majority of Senate Democrats support if they could? That budget is lurking in the background of this debate. It is the budget that the party's liberals would enact if they could. It is the budget that the President in the heart of hearts and his heart of hearts supports. It is certainly the budget that the folks at MSNBC support. It is the House Progressive Caucus budget, an intellectually honest presentation of the liberal fiscal policy position. For interested folks, take a look at pages H2362 to H2870 of the Congressional Record of April 15, 2011. There you will find the House Progressive Caucus budget's fine print and the debate over it. I ask unanimous consent to include a copy of that budget in the record at this point.
Without objection.
The Progressive Caucus budget is real, and it is ambitious. It is also politically risky. Like the House budget developed by Chairman Ryan, it took political courage. It's a statement of policy principles and numbers. And with the goose egg, as the stated Senate Democratic budget, from my perspective, the best place to look for the Democrats' position is the budget of the House Progressives. There's no doubt that that is where the sentiments of the majority of the Senate Democratic caucus really are. I also think the House Progressive budget offers a valuable contrast to the House-passed budget. Last time I checked, there were two major parties in Congress, and both parties should be accountable for what they would do about our perilous fiscal situation. So let's hold them to account. The House progressives aim to balance the budget by 2021. They aim to reduce public debt as a percentage of GDP to 64.1% by 2021. They aim for both taxes and spending to grow significantly, but to equal 22.3% of GDP by 2021. House progressives advocate a fulsome growth in the role of the federal government, with new domestic spending rising by $1.7 trillion. New domestic spending. And how do they propose to pay for all this? Well, the Democrats play hide and seek, or hide the ball on this issue. The House progressives are refreshingly frank. The short answer is tax hikes and cuts in defense spending. They propose $4 trillion in new taxes. Let's take a look at these new taxes. Raise marginal tax rates by 17 to 24% for single taxpayers. Just look at that chart there. There's an increase in the top marginal rates by 17% to 24%. There's a brand new, quote, millionaire, unquote, surtax with rates reaching as high as 47%. There's a new record high death tax rate of 65%. They treat capital gains and dividends as ordinary income. That means in some cases the marginal rate on capital gains and dividends would more than triple. They tax all overseas business income currently. That would mean, with respect to growing global markets, U.S. businesses would be subject to uniquely high levels of taxation. They create new taxes on banks and financial transactions. I'll remind folks that CBO told us last year this kind of tax would be passed through to bank customers and depositors. House progressives look to reform Social Security by raising the base of the payroll tax on both employers and employees. Look at this. My goodness. On health care, House progressive transparency is breathtaking.
The senator has used 10 minutes.
Madam President, I tell my distinguished colleague that we only have a few minutes left, and our senator from Utah is waiting. So if you could wrap up briefly, I have thoroughly enjoyed your remarks.
All right. I thank my colleague. Now, their budget anticipates taking Obamacare to the next level with government-run plan. And progressives would impose government negotiation of prescription drug payments. And where are the spending cuts? One word, defense. Defense will be cut by $2.3 trillion. Well, I thank my colleague for the little extra time and ask unanimous consent that the balance of my remarks be placed in the record at this point. And I intend to vote for 3 of these budgets today, and because the 3 of them make sense. They're not crazy. They're not phony. And each of the 3 would save Medicare and other matters in the federal government. I thank my colleague.
Without objection.
Senator, and I would just have to say your remarks about the progressive budget and the fact that it represents, I think, the heart of this Democratic Senate conference's view of budget is probably correct. And also, however, it represents a view that would be widely and strongly rejected by the American people. Senator Lee from Utah is a new senator. He's campaigned every corner of his state. He's had to talk about this issue and spending and listen to his people. I'm delighted to hear from him at this time. And, Madam President, how much time is left on this side?
1 minute and 15 seconds.
Madam President, I would ask unanimous consent that the senator from Utah have 4 minutes.
Is there objection?
I am fine with that if we would have that time added on our side as well.
I thank you, and I appreciate the chair.
So we would.
Without objection, 3 minutes will be added to each side. The senator from Utah.
My distinguished colleagues who have spoken this afternoon point out a truth that is impossible to refute, which is at the rate that the federal government is spending, we will have acquired $15 trillion of debt by the end of this year. That's a lot of money. It's requiring a lot of interest payment. That interest payment is only going to grow larger in the coming years. The Obama administration is already predicting that by the end of this decade, we'll be paying $1 trillion a year just to service the interest on our national debt. To put that in perspective, that's more than we spend on Social Security in an entire year, more than we spend on Medicare and Medicaid combined in an entire year, more than we spend on national defense in an entire year. I actually believe that 10 years is putting it optimistically. I think that day is coming much sooner. For that reason, I believe this body needs to pass a budget that balances. The problem has been this body has refused to do this. And every time we proceed with the idea that, well, we'll cut so many billions of dollars over the next 10 years, or every time that we adopt statutory spending caps, as we did with the Gramm-Rudman-Hollings Act almost 30 years ago, as we did with the PAYGO rules, Congress has treated those as something that Congress can exempt itself out of. Congress has become a walking, breathing waiver unto itself. The problem is that we, as a legislative body, cannot bind future Congresses. We can legislate. We can appropriate only for this Congress. And so our commitment now to save later isn't binding, unless, of course, we adopt an amendment to the U.S. Constitution that will bind future Congresses. That's why I've said I will oppose any and every attempt to raise the debt limit until such time as Congress has passed out of this body and presented to the states for ratification a balanced budget amendment to the U.S. Constitution, one that would require a two-thirds supermajority vote to authorize Congress to spend more than it takes in any given year and to spend more than 18% of gross domestic product in any given year. We cannot continue in perpetuity to rely on this kind of deficit spending. This will hurt every single federal program, whether you are most concerned on the one hand about preserving our ability to provide for our national defense, or on the other hand, if you're most concerned about preserving our entitlement programs. You ought to want a balanced budget amendment. You ought to be unwilling, as I am, to raise the debt limit until that amendment has been passed out by this body and by the House of Representatives and submitted to the states for ratification. Thank you, Madam President.
Then I would offer the balance of my remarks for the record,
Without objection.
and we yield the floor to my distinguished colleague, the chairman of the Budget Committee, with whom I have appreciated the opportunity to work, and would say again that he orchestrated a fine series of budget hearings with some fabulous witnesses that made us all nervous, but gave us some valuable insight, and I appreciate those good hearings, Senator Conrad, and appreciate the opportunity to work with you, and I'm sorry we're not able to mark up a budget this time, looks like.
Madam President,
Senator from North Dakota.
I want to thank the ranking member. Those hearings would not have been possible without the active working together of my office and his office, and I do think they were really an excellent set of hearings talking about the dimensions of the problem that we confront and that we are on an unsustainable course. We're borrowing 40 cents of every dollar. It can't continue. Madam President, after my brief remarks, I ask unanimous consent the following senators be recognized for up to 5 minutes off the Democratic time: Senator Menendez, Senator Lautenberg, Senator Begich, and Senator Whitehouse.
Without objection.
Madam President, I just briefly want to address this question of why we on our side have not laid down our budget proposal. And let me just repeat, we are in an unusual year. This is not going to be a circumstance in which there's a Republican budget, a Democratic budget, and you go to conference committee and they're resolved. Because we have a new process underway at the leadership level involving the White House. This is what the Republican leader himself said about that process. The discussions that can lead to a result between now and August are the talks being led by Vice President Biden. That's a process that could lead to a result, a measurable result. And in that meeting is the only Democrat who can sign a bill into law, in fact, the only American out of 307 million of us who can sign a bill into law. He is in those discussions. That will lead to a result. Madam President, we don't need a Democratic budget and a Republican budget. We need an American budget. We need a budget that is bipartisan because all of us know that is the only budget that can possibly be adopted. The Republicans control the House of Representatives. The Democrats control the Senate. The only possibility for us to make progress is a bipartisan budget. That's why I was deeply involved in the process on the President's Fiscal Commission. 18 of us for a year and it is the only place a bipartisan budget has so far emerged. 11 of us supported it, 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, and 1 independent. 11 of us out of the 18 on the commission. Madam President, we now have underway the Group of 5 talks, Democrats and Republicans working together. But most important, we have at the leadership level, Republican leaders from the House and the Senate, Democratic leaders from the House and the Senate, and the Vice President of the United States. What sense would it possibly make for us to go to markup of a budget before we have seen the results of these leadership talks? That makes no sense. We have a bipartisan discussion underway, Republican leaders, Democratic leaders, and the White House. We ought to have the courtesy and the patience to see if they come up with a plan that would then form the basis of the budget. I thank the Chair, yield the floor, and recognize Senator Menendez for 5 minutes.
The Senator from New Jersey.
Madam President, I rise deeply concerned that my colleagues on the other side, in their ideological haze, seem to have lost sight of the real people whose lives will be affected by the choices we make. It seems to me that the Republican budget proposal fails to realize that budgets are not just about numbers. They are about people, their hopes, their dreams, their aspirations for a better life for themselves and their families. Now, we all have a budget. Every family has one. Maybe we don't think of it formally, but we all do. You know, on the revenue side, it's our gainful employment, it's some investments we make, some interest on savings. And on the expenditure side, it's our mortgage payment, the tuition for our children's education, the contributions that we make to our church or synagogue, to a favorite charity who does a good cause. Those are all an expression of our personal values, just as the nation's budget is an expression of our collective values. Now, we may not always think of a budget in those terms, but it is about our values as a country. And we found out last night in upstate New York that the Republican vision of ending Medicare as we know it does not reflect American values, and voters are not buying it. Once again, our Republican colleagues have shown that they're out of touch with the American people and are on the wrong side of history when it comes to what Americans think is fair, what they think is right. Americans don't think it's right to give subsidies to big oil companies, tax breaks to millionaires, and take Medicare away from seniors. They are saying that it's time to abandon the tired refrain of ending Medicare as we know it, which is the Republican proposal. It's time to abandon their ideological agenda that leaves seniors to fend for themselves, because it's not who we are as a people, and it is not what Americans want. This week, I met with a group of seniors in Fort Lee, New Jersey. We discussed what the Republican budget cuts would do to the Medicare system that they have depended on for decades and what those who will come next will depend upon. At that Fort Lee Senior Center, under the Republican plan, a typical 65-year-old would pay an additional $7,000 by 2022. Right now, over 140,000 seniors in New Jersey are impacted by that donut hole, lack of coverage and prescription drugs. Under the Republican plan, those seniors will pay an additional $80 million for prescription drugs next year, and by 2020, New Jersey seniors currently in that donut an additional $1.6 billion. Nationwide, nearly 4 million seniors would pay $2.2 billion more for prescription drugs in 2012 alone under the Republican plan. And by turning Medicaid into a block grant program, the Republican plan could cost America more than 2 million private sector jobs over the next 5 years and threaten our economic recovery. But that's not all. Nationwide, the Republican plan could cut more than $500 billion in Medicaid funding for seniors and the disabled, including life-saving nursing home care, leaving us with the uncomfortable and unanswerable question I pose to my Republican friends. What will those people do? Where will they go? And what happens to them under the Republican budget plan? These are people, not budget numbers. What happens to them? Now, who pays to lower the deficit and who does not under this Republican budget proposal? The answer is clear and simple. Middle-class families pay, seniors pay, but nothing is asked of the wealthiest Americans, and big oil still gets billions in tax breaks. If we were serious about reducing the deficit in a balanced way, we would start with the obvious, subsidies for big oil. The top 5 oil companies earned nearly $1 trillion over the last decade. Passing my bill to repeal oil subsidies would save taxpayers $21 billion over 10 years. We can safely assume oil profits will be much greater in the decade to come with higher oil prices, but let's assume the top 5 oil companies only get another $1 trillion in profits over this next decade. Is it too much to ask them to forego $21 billion in profits that they are getting because of the tax cuts we're giving them when oil is trading at $100 a barrel and they produce it for 11? The answer to that question is no, Madam President. And so let's do this in a balanced way. We can do much better. We should reject the Republican budget.
The senator from New Jersey.
Yes, Madam President, thank you. And I rise with deepest hope that we're going to be able to defeat the House budget plan that we're about to vote upon. This Republican budget is a scheme that would endanger the quality of life for millions of Americans who now struggle to get by. Just look at the gas pump, and you'll see what I'm talking about. The Republicans want to make sure that the wealthy get wealthier with a new $1 trillion tax cut and put the burden on seniors, the middle class, and young people to pay for it. Paul Ryan, the House Republican member who hatched this scheme, has said, and I quote him here, "This isn't a budget, it's a cause. And if you ask me, it's a cause for alarm." The other side wants to terminate Medicare, one of the most successful programs ever developed in America, and turn it over to private insurance companies where CEOs now make millions. Under the Republican plan, many seniors will have to choose between medication and food to get by. And seniors' out-of-pocket health costs will cost more than double the present rate to $12,500 a year. The Republicans would hand seniors' health care over to insurance companies, where computers, instead of doctors, decide which benefits they'll receive. The Republicans also want to reduce federal Medicaid spending in half, taking away vital services like nursing home for seniors and health service for expectant mothers. All told, the Tea Party Republican budget would rip away health care coverage from 50 million Americans. But health care for seniors and other Americans isn't the only place Republicans want to go to punish them. The House budget plan doesn't just protect the Bush tax cuts for the rich. It reduces them to even lower levels at the expense of working families. Instead of more tax breaks for the wealthiest, we should be lifting up the foundation of our country, the middle class. In the past decade, the average income of the bottom 90% of workers has declined, while prices for everything escalate, and the top 1% saw incomes go up by $250,000 each. Imagine, the average income of the bottom 90% declined, while the top 1% saw incomes go up by $250,000 each. Mr. President, this budget also cuts Pell Grants, which help reduce the cost of back-breaking tuition for millions of college students. Mr. President, I never would have been able to attend Columbia University without government help from the GI Bill. It enabled me to co-found ADP, one of America's most successful companies, employing over 40,000 people today. In the post-World War II era, we created the greatest generation. I say, invest more in our people so they can create the next greatest generation, which cannot be done without our help in education. We need help to a more balanced approach to solving our fiscal problems, including asking the wealthy to carry their fair share of the load. Now, I was a CEO for many years, and I learned that you can't create a great company or a country without sufficient resources. This is no time, as we fight our way out of recession, to penalize the middle class, the senior citizens, or the young. This is the time to invest in tomorrow without penalizing those who pay the largest price now for their very existence. Let those who can pay for the rebuilding of an America we all love. That's the way we ought to do it, and I urge my colleagues to vote no on this Ryan budget. With that, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Alaska.
Mr. President, I rise today to speak about the ongoing budget negotiations. As a member of the Senate Budget Committee, I've jumped into this debate head on. But we are all here together. This is why I've asked the Alaskans in my state and my communities all across the state to share their ideas with me on how to cut the budget. And I put forward a series of cuts and spending management programs from ideas from my colleagues or my members throughout the state, but also ideas I picked up in my budget hearings. We know we're all going to feel the pinch if we're serious about getting our budget and spending under control. But I have made it crystal clear. I absolutely will not balance the budget on the backs of seniors. For me, the budget is a moral document. It reflects our values as a nation, and it demonstrates our commitment to supporting our elders and protecting our children. It is the future pathway of our great country. But the Republican House budget that has passed the House and proposed today for us to vote on does not reflect these values. That's why Congressman Ryan received an earful from seniors when he went back home to Wisconsin after rolling out his plan, his scheme, on, in my view, setting us back decades. It's why voters in New York yesterday rejected Republicans in their extreme plan to eliminate Medicare as we know it, by electing a Democrat in a Republican district. I mention New York not because this was a win for Democrats or a loss for Republicans, but because this was a win for our seniors, and because the stakes are too high. Americans all across the country are saying no to the current Republican plan. That could fail to automatically enroll our seniors in Medicare and instead force them to buy health coverage from a private insurance company. And let me make it very clear on the private insurance company. Medicare today, to administer, costs about 1.5%. So all the rest of the money for Medicare goes to services, to programs, to ensure health care for our seniors. If insurance companies got hold of this, their costs to administer would be 20 to 30%. Clearly, less services for our seniors. In Alaska, over the next 10 years, under this Republican House plan that passed, that's here in front of the Senate for us to vote on, we'll move the cost for Medicare for my constituents in Alaska from $5,000 of their cost, and in 10 years, over $10,000. On top of that, it will force seniors to pay an average of $3,500 more for prescription drugs over the next 10 years. Again, adding to about $8,500 from seniors in additional health care costs. At the same time, this budget that they want us to approve, which of course I'm not going to, will give millionaires another $1.2 trillion in additional reductions. At the same time, sticking it to our seniors. It will truly end Medicare as we know it today. In Alaska, our elders are revered. We respect their wisdom, and they guide our decisions. As a people, it is our duty to care for our elders as they grow older. The Republican plan, the Ryan budget, will cost, as I said, Alaska seniors dearly, thousands and thousands of dollars per year, more than they're paying today. Seniors who are on fixed incomes. And in Alaska, we have one of the fastest growing senior populations in the nation by percent. So I continue to look forward to my colleagues, with my colleagues on the other side and my colleagues on this side, to figure out how we're going to move forward on this budget, but let's not do it on the backs of seniors by throwing them over the ship and never looking back. Seniors paid into it, seniors expect it, and we have an obligation to ensure they have the health care that ensures that they have a quality of life and live in dignity in their later years. Mr. President, thank you for the opportunity, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, first, thank you for the courtesy of taking my time in the chair so that I have the chance to deliver these remarks. As a personal courtesy, that is much appreciated. We are gathered here on the Senate floor to face a very stark fact, and that is that the House Republican budget would end Medicare as we know it for future generations. The House Republican budget would increase costs for current beneficiaries right away, and the House Republican budget would do real damage to seniors across this country and in my home state of Rhode Island. With gas prices at near record highs, unemployment numbers still in double digits, most folks are focused on making ends meet. They deserve a budget that will improve economic opportunity in our country, balance our budget, and maintain Medicare, Medicaid, and other programs on which so many Americans rely. The House Republican budget fails every one of these tests. It ends Medicare, it lowers taxes for most corporations and the most fortunate, who already pay less often than the average American, all while failing to balance the budget. The House Budget Committee chairman has claimed that, and I quote, "Our budget makes no changes for those in or near retirement." This claim that this budget resolution won't affect Americans who are already retired is simply flat out false. The House budget reopens the Medicare Part D donut hole that we closed in the reform bill. That will cost nearly 17,000 Rhode Island seniors in 2012 alone nearly $9.5 million out of pocket. Seniors at the Da Vinci Center in Providence, at the Meadows in North Smithfield, and so many other places who've gone without a cost of living adjustment in their Social Security benefits for 2 straight years, even as costs have steadily risen at the pharmacy, at the grocery store, and at the pump, taking away their prescription drug assistance, charging them an additional $9.5 million, that hits them too hard and too soon, in 2012, literally right away. The Republican budget also ends Medicare as we know it for future generations. Planning to retire in 11 years? No Medicare. You instead will be forced to buy private health insurance from insurance companies standing between you and your doctors instead of the reliable, affordable insurance provided by Medicare. The nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office estimates that this would double what retirees would pay out of pocket under the current system, more than $6,000 extra per retiree. And the Republican attack on Medicare overlooks a basic fact, that all health care costs are skyrocketing, irrespective of who the insurer is. Defense Secretary Gates just said everybody knows that we're being eaten alive by health care. There is a cost problem in health care, but attacking Medicare fundamentally misdiagnoses the problem. But that's another speech. I recently held an official Senate Aging Committee hearing at the Johnston Senior Center in Rhode Island to give Rhode Islanders the chance to make their voices heard. Audrey Brett, a Middletown resident who relies on Social Security and Medicare, said this: "For all those Americans who worked, paid their taxes, added to the betterment of the country, served in military and civil service, we cannot let them live and die in poverty. We owe them their final days of security and dignity." Audrey's right. But the Republican budget gets rid of that promise of security and dignity contained in Medicare. Medicare, as we know it, is lost. And here is what's protected. Tax cuts for the super-rich, who already pay lower tax rates than the average American tax-paying family, protected. Tax cuts for many large corporations, many of whom now pay no taxes at all, protected. And remember, the Republicans just voted last week to protect big oil tax subsidies. Wreck Medicare, protect those tax cuts and subsidies. Those are not America's priorities. Let's put real priorities first, Medicare, and allowing our seniors to enjoy a stable and dignified retirement. I see the Majority Leader is here on the floor. I yield back the remainder of my time and yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Majority Leader.
it's my understanding that we have 5 minutes left. I'm to take that time. Is that right?
The Leader is correct.
The vote that we're going to have shortly is about more than just public policy, Mr. President. It's really about priorities. It's about whether we hold fast to our values or break our promises. There's a lot wrong with the House Republican budget in which each senator is about to cast a vote, but the most irresponsible and defensible ideas in it is a radical plan to end Medicare as we've known it. Doing so would break a solemn promise between our society and our seniors. It's a promise that for more than 4 decades has saved seniors from poverty, illness, and worse. The promise of Medicare is this: if you work hard and contribute, America will make sure you are protected in your golden years from the hardships of affording health care. The Republican budget would break this promise. It would make life significantly more difficult and painful for America's seniors. It's as simple and as serious as that. The Republican plan would kill Medicare. Even the conservative Wall Street Journal admitted this, even though most Republican United States senators still refuse to face this reality. That is, that, as the Wall Street Journal said, the Republican plan would kill Medicare. The Wall Street Journal. Here's what it would do. It would turn over seniors' health to profit-hungry insurance companies. It would let bureaucrats decide what tests and treatments seniors get. And it would ask seniors to pay more for their benefits, for their health care, charging every senior $6,000 more every year in exchange for fewer benefits. That's a bad deal, Mr. President, all around. Those voting for this Republican plan would be forcing seniors in Nevada to pay more than twice as much as they pay today in out-of-pocket costs. Sadly, Mr. President, that's just not a Nevada problem. It's an Alaska problem. It's a problem that faces every state in the Union, $6,000 more for every senior. Those voting for the Republican plan to kill Medicare would be voting to reopen the donut hole that we closed to help seniors afford expensive prescription drugs. Opening the donut hole would send drug prices literally through the roof, costing, for example, 27,000 seniors in Nevada thousands of dollars more between now and the year 2020, and every other state. Those voting for the Republican plan to kill Medicare would also be forcing our seniors to pay almost $1 million more for annual wellness visits that we put in our health care bill. They would make it harder for seniors to access nursing homes and long-term care and would make at least 34 million more Americans uninsured. The Republican plan to kill Medicare was written in the name of saving money. But listen to this, Mr. President. It costs seniors so much money that it doesn't do anything that they said it would do. One study found that seniors would spend $14 more for every dollar the government saves. That's $14 to 1 in the wrong direction. That's not effective economics anyplace. And it's certainly not worth endangering the health of our seniors. The Republican plan to kill Medicare is a plan that tries to balance the budget literally on the backs of America's seniors. This is a clear window into the other party's priorities, though. While it asks seniors to pay more and more, it allows the wealthiest to pay less and less. It gives even more tax breaks to those who need it the least: oil companies, billionaires, multinational companies that ship jobs overseas. It comes down to this, Mr. President. The Republican plan to kill Medicare is a plan to make the rich richer and the sick sicker. A well-worn metaphor characterizes this body that we serve, the Senate, as a saucer, as a deliberative body that cools the intense heat and occasional zeal of the House of Representatives. In voting down the radical Republican House-passed plan to end Medicare, in keeping our nation's priorities straight and keeping our promise to our seniors, we're bringing that image to life, that image our founding fathers had of this great body, the United States Senate. I would ask that we now, Mr. President, I ask that we proceed to counter number 36, H. Conrad's 34, and I ask for the yeas and nays on my motion.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. Questions on the motion to proceed? Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka, Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Balkis, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Bingaman, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown of Massachusetts. Mr. Brown of Ohio. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Conrad. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Dement. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heller. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hutchison. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inouye. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Kerry. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Cole. Mr. Kyle. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Lautenberg. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Levin. Mr. Lieberman. Mr. Lugar. Mr. Manchin. Mr. McCain. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Ms. Mikulski. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson of Nebraska. Mr. Nelson of Florida. Mr. Paul. Mr. Portman. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Nevada.
Yeah, right here. Yes, sir.
Mr. Risch.
That's pretty nice. That looks good. Is that really true?
Mr. Roberts.
No, they had stuff in that bitch all the way into the
Mr. Rockefeller.
No. Yeah,
Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Sessions. Mrs. Shaheen.
You're talking to a different set than I'm talking to. You're talking to JP Morgan Chase.
Mr. Shelby. Ms. Snow.
What's 44?
Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall of Colorado. Mr. Udall of New Mexico. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Warner. Mr. Webb. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Ayotte, Barrasso, Blunt, Bozeman, Burr, Coates, Coburn, Cochran, Corker, Cornyn, DeMint, Heller, Hoeven, Inhofe, Isaacson, Kirk, Kyle, Lee, Lugar, McCain, McConnell, Rubio, Sessions, Thune, Toomey, Vitter, Wicker. Senators voting in the negative: Akaka, Begich, Blumenthal, Brown of Massachusetts, Brown of Ohio, Cantwell, Cardin, Casey, Collins, Conrad, Coons, Feinstein, Inouye, Kerry, Klobuchar, Lautenberg, Leahy, Lieberman, Manchin, McCaskill, Murray, Nelson of Florida, Paul, Pryor, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Rockefeller, Shaheen, Snow, Stabenow, Tester, Whitehouse. Mr. Franken, no. Mr. Enzi, aye. Mr. Udall of New Mexico, no. Mr. Bingaman, no. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, aye. Mr. Wyden, no. Mr. Johans, aye. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Bennett, no. Mr. Warner, no. Mrs. Hagan, no. Mr. Nelson of Nebraska, no. Mr. Webb, no. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, no. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Menendez, no. Ms. Markowski, no. Mr. Sanders, no. Mr. Harkin, no. Mr. Shelby, aye. Mr. Udall of Colorado, no. Mr. Carper, no. Mr. Baucus, no. Mr. Durbin, no. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Chambliss, aye. Mr. Merkley, no. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Hatch. Aye. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mrs. Boxer. Mrs. Boxer, no. Ms. Mikulski. Ms. Mikulski, no. Mr. Levin. Mr. Levin, no. Ms. Landrieu. Ms. Landrieu, no.
Does any senator still wish to vote or to change their vote? If not, on this vote, the yeas are 40, the nays are 57. The motion is not agreed to.